Здравствуйте, уважаемые зрители канала «Наше завтра». Сегодня мы по скайпу вновь беседуем с Мэтью Ehretом. Мы беседовали с ним уже один раз, было много положительных откликов. Мэтью Ehret – это писатель из Канады, специалист по геополитике, автор книги «Столкновение двух Америк. Незаконченная симфония». Ее сейчас переводят на русский язык. Она будет опубликована. Также Мэтью Ehret – автор серии из 4 книг «Нерассказанная история Канады». И в этих работах он поднимает целый ряд глобальных важных тем, которые мы отчасти будем обсуждать сегодня. Вопрос к Мэтью первый. Вот почему вы в своих работах так много уделяете внимания периоду правления Рузвельта?
Well, I believe that the figure of Franklin Delano Roosevelt as an American president in recent history is so extremely strategic and important to shed light on, because on the one hand, we are living through a world which is facing a great existential crisis, which has many parallels to that same crisis that Franklin Roosevelt had faced in 1932 when he emerged victorious from the elections that were happening then in the midst of the Great Depression. I think that there are many things to learn from, and this is why much of our recent history, for people living even in the United States, they do not know their own history. It's been rewritten and scrubbed. There are many things that are parallel to our current crisis. When Franklin Roosevelt entered office, there was not just a Great Depression caused by something bad that happened in 1929 of an economic bubble collapsing and going into a depression. What he had was a 30-year process of decay from McKinley's assassination in 1901 all the way until that stock market collapse, which involved 30 years of deregulation, the growth of a foreign financial agency within the heart of the United States that took over with the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, that liberalized and deregulated the economy to allow for increasing rates of speculation, the destruction of investments into the real economy, which had accelerated in the 1920s, the roaring 20s, where it was unbounded, everybody for themselves. You can make money by gambling instead of producing anything of value. And what we saw was this type of insanity that created a bubble economy of gambling instead of a real economy. This is what was destroyed in 1929 as a pinprick, which also involved from 1929 to 33, the biggest wealth transfer in history. It was orchestrated, similar to today, where we have now 50 or so years of consumerism, deregulation since the assassination of John F. Kennedy and his brother, where the real economy, the infrastructure, the means of producing real wealth like manufacturing and factories has been outsourced. Our investments into heavy industry, machine tools, science has been destroyed. And so instead of having a real economy, the thing which is now collapsing in the West is a bubble that's overvalued by a factor of 20 to 40 times the real GDP of the United States and the West. The only way to get out of this oncoming systemic breakdown is to realize that the economy has become, just like in 1929, a time bomb, a bubble that can be systematically destroyed. And those who are proposing a great reset, a solution, are the same ones who have created the problem to begin with, just like Franklin Roosevelt faced a global fascist banker's dictatorship in 1929 from London and from his own Wall Street forces who he did battle with throughout the entire time of his 3 terms in office. Well, he died on his 4th. So today we have people talking about a Green New Deal as a solution for a great reset, which will ultimately bring about something much worse than anything we've ever faced as a society if we permit this to go through. And it has nothing to do with the original New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt. And people would be able to see that very clearly if they understood this history, which is why I wrote the book.
Вы можете нам рассказать некие подробности относительно такого интересного инструмента в политике Рузвельта, как финансовая корпорация реконструкции? По сути, это банк развития экономики, такой сверхбанк, который расцвел в период Рузвельта, хотя был инициирован и до него.
The Reconstruction Finance Corporation was an incredible instrument for progress that many people do not understand as well, which is, I devote a lot of time in my book to this power, this instrument of government. Franklin Roosevelt himself wanted originally to create a national bank, what are called a national credit bank with 12 branches tied to an industrial board to provide long-term productive credit for industrial development around big projects. And the thing with Franklin Roosevelt is he had a top-down view, a program for building what's called the Four Corridors, major infrastructure from the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Hoover Dam, the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Colorado River Basin, very much similar to the thinking in China's Belt and Road Initiative today. A large-scale macro design with thousands of smaller infrastructure projects to rehabilitate and revive the industrial base that had been decimated under the Great Depression. The U.S. had lost, I think, something like 50% of its industrial force. Unemployment was over 25%. This had to be revived. The healthy tissue had to be revived. So the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was a compromise, since his original design for the credit bank was not passed. It was rejected by J.P. Morgan and other assets in the House and the Senate. Those bills were destroyed. Instead, the compromise was, okay, we will use the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that had formerly been created by the previous government under Hoover, but it had formerly been used to simply bail out failed Wall Street banks that had gambled with other people's money. And so originally, when Roosevelt entered the RFC, which is a government-run corporation, it was capitalized with $500 million, but it could use that to leverage and invest and loan upwards of 3 to 4 times more. But 79% was all being given to bail out banks. Nothing was being given to the productive economy. So Roosevelt changed that. And under the reformed RFC, he had a collaborator of his, Jesse Jones, who was an industrialist and ensured that this bank could be used to provide loans directly, as well as it could create other corporations like the Homeowners and Loan Corporation, or the Federal Farm and Mortgage Corporation, or the Export-Import Bank. All of these were created by the RFC. It was able to provide, again, direct loans to these instruments, as well as the Tennessee Valley Authority and other authorities like the Works Progress Administration, which were then able to invest in machine tools. They were able to build the hydroelectric dams, build the electricity grids, which were able to then begin a qualitative transformation of society and put millions of people to work. There was this was the key. And Franklin Roosevelt himself was a student of American history. He understood very much what was the constitutional banking traditions, which his own grandfather was a part of Hamiltonian banking, which the RFC was largely responsible for acting as an instrument as a national bank should have been, and more. And in the course of the 13 years of his presidency, it emitted over $33 billion of loans. By the end of World War II, it had given more loans than all of the Wall Street and even commercial banks. So it was the primary lender, and it was the secret ingredient to the industrial recovery of the United States that allowed it to emerge as the world's greatest productive force at the end of World War II.
Кто повлиял на взгляды Рузвельта? Откуда вообще возникла идея развивать финансовую корпорацию реконструкции?
There were, I think, 2 primary factors in this, in Roosevelt's understanding. You had, in the course of the 30 years before he won the presidency, Franklin Roosevelt was involved with what is sometimes dubbed the American System Caucus, a variety of bipartisan senators and congressmen from both sides of the aisle who were trying to fight back as a nationalist resistance against the League of Nations, against the Federal Reserve, against this deep state infiltration of their own nation that emerged especially over the dead body of President William McKinley, who had died, as I said, in 1901. So there were coalitions of people around this caucus who had done quite an impressive battle. And when Roosevelt emerged, he worked very closely with many of them to pass the most important legislation to do battle with Wall Street, to break up the banks with Glass-Steagall, which involved breaking up the speculative and versus the commercial banking, and bringing about this type of recovery that I was talking about. The other thing is Roosevelt himself was a part of a family. His grandfather was Isaac Roosevelt, who was a key collaborator with Alexander Hamilton and was the director of the National Bank branch of New York that was instrumental after the American Revolution in funding things like the Erie Canal, one of the biggest infrastructure projects in history, and many other projects that involved the U.S. moving from a purely backwater, underdeveloped agricultural zone, which it was in the revolutionary period, into becoming a industrially advanced society. It was by building these large projects, by the emission of Hamiltonian credit through a national bank. These were ultimately killed by Andrew Jackson in 1932, the Second National Bank. And the population was able to quadruple 4 times, to the point that the U.S. very quickly became a threat economically to the British Empire, which was never simply a military empire, but was always a financial empire globally extended above nations. So the idea of the American system of political economy, which was advanced by the forces around Isaac Roosevelt, who was always seen as a role model by Franklin, was very important in the formation of his understanding of economics. We have texts that he had written in high school, his thesis, that involved, in 1903, his discussions and description of his understanding of the fight between Aaron Burr, the founder of the modern deep state, and Wall Street. Aaron Burr is the man who killed Alexander Hamilton and tried to create a breakup of the Union in 1804, with the Northern Confederacy broken away from a Southern slave confederacy. And Aaron Burr, on several occasions, tried to break up the Union. And the only thing that stopped him was Alexander Hamilton, who he assassinated. So Franklin Roosevelt had studied this. He studied physical economy. He studied those principles. He understood Abraham Lincoln's greenback system. And he also understood what the nature of the political fight was for the nation, but also for humanity. So there's a lot of evidence, and I go through that in several chapters in my book, the nature of what is this longer term tradition, which involved 8 American presidents dying while in office, including Franklin Roosevelt himself, some by bullets, others by more mysterious causes, but all of them doing the exact same thing by invoking the constitutional principles of Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, which gives authority to the nation state to direct the flow of credit and economic activity for the general welfare, which is what the fight is really about. In every nation, if you're a sovereign nation, you have the right to utilize these powers.
Каков был замысел Рузвельта относительно создания МВФ и Всемирного банка?
This was a very big discovery for me and for a lot of people, because the IMF and the World Bank have not done a lot of good for humanity for the past 70 or 80 years. In fact, what we have seen instead has been the creation of neocolonialism, usurious debt slavery, and many conditionalities that have enslaved and caused underdevelopment in much of the world due to the IMF and World Bank forms of lending, which is not really lending. Now, when you actually look at the combat that had happened around Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, which was a 2-week conference with representatives from all over the world, this is the conference that created what was called the Bretton Woods system, that would define what would be the nature of the post-World War II operating system. There was a major combat that is so valuable to understand between 2 different factions. People are told the British and the Americans were completely partners in crime, in running the Cold War and running the neocolonial systems, and that Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill were close friends this whole time. That was a mythology that was never true. And one can see that clearly by looking at the combat. The forces around the British Empire had deployed their Fabian Society operative named John Maynard Keynes to represent the Bank of England and the interests of maintaining the British Empire at Bretton Woods. Franklin Roosevelt's people had a very different idea, and they were represented by the figure of primarily Dexter White. Harry Dexter White, who represented the American delegation. And they did 2 weeks of combat over whether or not the British Empire and colonialism was going to be protected, or whether nation states would be encouraged to develop their full spectrum economies, industry, infrastructure, through an internationalization of the New Deal. So the experience that the U.S. had within its own backyard from 1933 onward of the Tennessee Valley Authority, the transformation of the rural, ignorant backwater population that was illiterate and had no electricity into becoming an industrially advanced, very literate society just a decade or so later. That idea was something compatible with Africa, South America, India, China, beyond. And this is where the IMF, the World Bank, were created to be originally, by Harry Dexter White's designs, instruments for long-term lending at low interest, no conditionalities, but specifically for providing Tennessee Valley authorities and other things. The World Bank was as well, and Dexter White was the first head of the IMF. Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, was always an enemy of this idea. Keynes instead wanted to have a one world sort of currency, a basis of exchange around the Bancorp, which would be controlled by the Bank of England and the Bank of International Settlements, the sort of central bank of central banks that had tried already in 1933 to be the center of command with the League of Nations of a global Great Reset, a banker's dictatorship. And this is what Franklin Roosevelt had sabotaged earlier. John Maynard Keynes was a major part of that. So this was the idea. John Maynard Keynes was a mathematician. He said central banks must be always private, must control mathematical equilibriums that would be constrained upon every nation's permission to spend, and budgets would always have to be balanced. And ultimately, the markets otherwise on a private sector would be kept hedonistic and free for ultimately unbounded speculation as the system liberalized. The American delegation said instead, no, the economy has to be governed by increases of productive power through scientific progress, long-term 10 to 20-year credit emissions for projects that would increase the rate of real value of the system. Unfortunately, what we did see, well, on the one hand, the American delegation did win, and there was agreements to sponsor Tennessee Valley authorities in India, in China, in South America, and beyond, but they were never permitted. There was also a bill at Bretton Woods to disband the Bank of International Settlements, which was agreed upon but was never acted upon. Dexter White died in 1948. He and many other members of Franklin Roosevelt's trusted circle who had this vision, like Sumner Wells, like Henry Wallace. There were many, many others. Harry Hopkins were all labeled red communists, agents who had to be destroyed under the witch hunts that had occurred immediately with Roosevelt's early death. And the banks, the World Bank, the IMF, became captured and utilized by the Anglo-American financial cartels to then be instruments of empire instead of instruments of progress as they were originally intended to be. And so that's the story of that.
Вы жестко критикуете Кейнса в своей книге. Мне хотелось бы узнать, почему и какие у вас есть претензии к его деятельности.
Yes, that's a good question. Although we are told, all students of history of economy are told that Franklin Roosevelt was a Keynesian and the New Deal was Keynesian, that is a complete devastating lie. Roosevelt himself, upon meeting Keynes, referred to Keynes as a mathematician, not an economist, who had weird fetishes he even commented upon. And that was his assistant, Francis Perkins, his friend and ally, who documented this. And Keynes himself commented that Franklin Roosevelt was an economic illiterate. So they did not agree on anything fundamental when it came to economics. Now, Keynes himself, as I get through in several chapters as well in my book, was a member of the Cambridge Apostles. He was a high-level eugenicist. He was a part of the Eugenics Society. He was a treasurer of it. He was also a pedophile. That's another side thing. But he also, as a mathematician of perversity, he did have budget books, diaries filled with mathematical grading systems of his sexual exploits. He was also a firm believer of Malthus and was a part of the Neo-Malthusian League promoting decreases of world population. And he believed that the instruments of government should only be used to service the interests of a scientific dictatorship to advance eugenics and population control. He even devoted his original book, his famous manual, originally to Germany, and he actually said this would best be put into implementation by the type of government we see it with Hitler's Germany in 1936. So the thing with Keynes is, yes, he said when there is an economic crisis, you should spend money by the government. He said that, and that is sort of what happened. However, the difference is that in Keynes's interpretation of what's happening, where does the value come from? Keynes puts everything upside down. He says in his theory of value that the value comes from people satisfying their hedonistic lusts. That's what they ultimately want. When a government spends money when you have an economic crisis, it doesn't matter if you're paying a paycheck to somebody to dig a hole and another paycheck to somebody to fill the hole back up again. It doesn't matter if you're building windmills or nuclear power. $100 spent here and $100 spent here is the same thing. It's all mathematically equivalent. In his view, he says, well, by giving somebody a paycheck to fill a hole that's been dug by somebody else, both people will go home, spend the money as consumers on things that they want. And the act of spending then creates a demand to produce. That demand to produce will then stimulate industries, and industries will require electricity, and that will require infrastructure to be created, and the infrastructure to be created will be then provided by government. So in fact, the idea of value is the very opposite, whereas Franklin Roosevelt and all people who understood what Roosevelt understood about Hamiltonian economics as a science of political economy understood that it is intention to increase the national power and uplift the quality of life and quality of minds of people by the investments into projects that are 10, 20-year in orientation, but not chaotic. It's not random. It's designed, much like, as I said today, the Belt and Road Initiative has a flexible, but yet still very concrete design for projects that will uplift and eliminate poverty, but give people give nations national powers and also new discoveries and inventions that would be incorporated into the productive process so that the system would not be bounded by mathematical equilibrium, but rather be unbounded by the physical productive processes that are tied to human creativity and human intentions, human designs, mind over matter. That's the key. And the idea of the Roosevelt and Hamiltonian system is debt. Certain debts have an anti-inflationary value because the debt is servicing the needs of society, creating self-liquidating debts. This idea of debt is not compatible with the British imperial economic designs. And that's what Keynes is.
Можно ли назвать Кеннеди продолжателем политики Рузвельта или подходов Рузвельта?
Yes, after Roosevelt died, there was decay, and the system was captured by Keynesian planning, which resulted in a destruction of long-term coherent scientific planning based upon Roosevelt's orientation, which is not dictatorial because it was also the unification of private sector enterprise. The private sector flourished, as well as state-directed guidance. It was a unification of both. That was destroyed after Roosevelt died, and the economy went through a series of recessions, bad ones, that lost 50% of America's industrial productive power had been destroyed when Kennedy had entered office at the end of 1960, replacing a well-intentioned but otherwise very naive Eisenhower. Kennedy understood that he was the heir to Roosevelt's New Deal and spoke in many lectures, speeches, about the need to revive the principles of the New Deal of Roosevelt. And he did so not by utilizing a Reconstruction Finance Corporation, but he did so in a number of other ways that involved forcing credit towards the obedience of the productive needs and recovery of the industrial base of America through big projects. He had things like the investment tax credit for industries that were productive, that would receive very important financial incentives to invest in building new factories and upgrading your technology in your companies, which was extremely important to make it more valuable and more profitable to do productive things instead of doing destructive things that were based more on speculation. Kennedy's program overall went into combat with U.S. Steel, which was the J.P. Morgan steel conglomerates that were trying to shut down the productivity of the United States, because ultimately Kennedy was also trying to use the revived economic base, which were built hundreds of great water projects, hydroelectric dams, nuclear power designs, major infrastructure were not only done inside of the U.S., but he was trying to work with African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, South American leaders, Mexican leaders, and others in Asia around helping them build these big projects the way Franklin Roosevelt had planned, but which were all sabotaged. So Kennedy was not able to fully capture the use of proper national banking, but he came very close in his 1,000 days in office before he was assassinated, and many of his ideas were subverted.
В наше время возможно ли возрождение подходов Рузвельта? В США, я имею в виду.
I would say that today the recovery of Franklin Roosevelt's approach to economic planning is vitally important for the United States, though I am having my doubts whether under current conditions it is currently viable with the current leadership being what it is on the federal level of the United States, where instead of the New Deal type of thinking, what we see are Keynesian formats of Green New Deals that involve utilizing some of the structures. You even see some legislation to revive national banking currently inside of the U.S. government. But the overall, the paradigm animating these structures that are being attempted to be brought online have no connection with the original New Deal. The original New Deal was based, as I said, on increasing national power and increasing your ability to have a better quality of people, more people, and a better, stronger sovereign nation after shutting down the Wall Street and London banks' controls over the U.S. economy. Today's Green New Deal is the opposite. It is written by those very same London and Wall Street financiers who are tied to something very, very bad. The idea of the Green New Deal green energy grids would have the effect of reducing national power by getting America to rely on low quality sources of energy that is very unreliable, and will shut down the means of production even more than they already have. It will only contribute to depopulation, if anything, and tying the nation into a central banker's global dictatorship today. I think that it is much more viable that this type of Hamiltonian Franklin Roosevelt approach to banking be revived, ironically, in countries which people do not think of as being very American. But China, as I said, has demonstrated one of the clearest displays of awareness of the science of real economics of Roosevelt. I think Russia today has a major battle on its hands, but I think that it would be incredible. We know that Vladimir Putin has an intention for a form of Eastern manifest destiny to open up the Arctic, open up the Far East, which requires a type of use of a national bank that will permit for long-term credit emissions the way the Chinese four major national banks do permit for, and the creation of other subsidiaries that would be subservient to the national interest to fulfilling this mission, which will take 10, 20, 50, 100 years to properly develop the sorts of economic ambitions for fusion power, space technology, the extension of the economy into outer space, asteroid defense, the lunar bases that Russia and China are currently working on together. These are multi-generational projects which require a bank that the current Bank of Russia, the current central bank, does not have the ability to do that based upon the current paradigm of balancing budgets and obeying the laws provided by the World Trade Organization or the IMF. So I think a certain Hamiltonian reform to fulfill those broad and beautiful visions for real long-term development would be wonderful, and I think very compatible with Russia right now. And it would also provide an incredible creative flank to the West, which has lost itself. So it would be very ironic and very brilliant if Chinese and Russian and other leaders of the world could demonstrate what being American actually is to an America and a West that has completely lost itself. I think it would be a brilliant thing to do. And it would also actually help carry into reality these ideas.
Мэтью, скажите, пожалуйста, о чем мечтал Рузвельт в плане выстраивания отношений с Советским Союзом? Каков был его план на то, как вот в будущем должны выстраиваться отношения с Советским Союзом? И почему этот план не был воплощен в жизнь?
I think it's incredibly important, and I find it almost humorous to look at the different photographs of Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill over the years of World War II. And what one will always find is that Stalin and Churchill are never seated together. Roosevelt is always between them, because ultimately Stalin rightfully never trusted Churchill, and neither did Roosevelt. Both of them understood, they had a very firm agreement, and they both understood that Winston Churchill represented the worst elements of 19th century imperialism that was only obsessed with preserving the empire. They also both understood that there were fifth columns embedded within the United States, working closely with the fascists, with Mussolini, with Hitler, that had worked to try to kill Roosevelt under coup d'etat attempts, utilizing Smedley Butler, a retired general who blew the whistle, and even tried to kill him with an assassination attempt in 1933 February with a Freemason, an anarchist Freemason, Zangara. So these were all sponsored by the same hives of financiers who created the Great Depression, who were supporting eugenics and who were supporting fascism as the economic miracle solution. Stalin had been dealing with his own fifth columns around Trotsky as well within Russia that had been organizing and colluding with Nazis, with Ukrainian Nazis, as well as German, as well as with British Nazis, as well as with Japanese fascists to overthrow Stalin throughout the 1930s. There's been some wonderful research that's been done by Grover Furr and others on this topic. And many declassified documents have come to the surface in recent years that I think are very valuable to prove this. So both of them had fifth columns within their countries, and both had a common vision that the world could be created afresh after World War II based upon sovereign nation states developing their full spectrum industrial and scientific capabilities. Stalin didn't agree with Trotsky's view of global permanent revolution. The fact that the Trotskyists became the neoconservatives after Trotsky died, people like James Burnham, Albert Wolstetter, and many others who became these were the neoconservatives who did carry on in a new way inside of America this Trotskyite sort of view of global chaos to create a situation that could induce a solution concept of effectively a unipolar superstate, which is what James Burnham talks about, Trotsky's former personal assistant. This is what both of them were battled with internally, and they both understood, and Stalin he very much wanted the great dream of an international New Deal to be preserved, which is why he ensured that Russia was going to be an original subscriber to the IMF. In Bretton Woods, Russia was going to be a member of the IMF. It was going to be a participant in these great development projects. And it was unfortunately only with Roosevelt's early death in April 12th, 1945, and the takeover of the presidency by Wall Street under a puppet named Truman, that things like the atomic bombs were unnecessarily launched onto a defeated Japan as a direct message to Russia that things are now completely different. And there was a major push as well by the followers of people around Burnham, as well as people like Bertrand Russell, who were then calling in 1946 for utilizing nuclear weapons against Russia to intimidate Russia to submit to a one world government. So unfortunately, there was still American patriotic resistance that was able to sort of push back against that. But Stalin was very, very, very sad and he had said that the great dream has died when he discovered that Roosevelt had died. And keep in mind, there was never an autopsy done on Roosevelt's body. So anybody who says that they know exactly how Roosevelt died by natural causes, they don't know what they're talking about. There was never an autopsy done. And so no evidence was actually done. And Stalin even told Roosevelt's son, Elliot Roosevelt, in an interview that I cite in my book, that he believed it was Churchill's people who did poison Roosevelt. And he said that these are the same groups that are trying to kill me as well, which is a whole story unto itself.
Уважаемые зрители, мы завершаем передачу. Мэтью Эрет был по скайпу с нами на связи. Мы еще встретимся. Следите за нашими передачами. И когда выйдет его книга на русском языке, я, безусловно, покажу ее в экран. И у вас будет возможность ее заказать, купить, если вам это интересно. До свидания. Спасибо. До свидания, Мэтью.
До свидания.